FBI.
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 They're gonna call the FBI.
Oh, just call it the fucking FBI.
Call FBI. Ask for Agent Crawford.
FBI!
Zebra has the microfilm. Repeat, the drop is scheduled for midnight. Target is approaching the vehicle. We have eyes on the package. Stand by for extraction.
Wire confirmed. Subject in motion.
Roger. Maintaining distance.
We're under heavy attack in Sector 4.
Reroute the defense grid now.
I need eyes on that encryption key immediately.
He told Leo about the Duquesne spy ring, a network of 33 German agents who were discovered and convicted in the largest espionage case in U.S. history. It wasn't a story of thrilling captures in the dead of night. It was a story of patience, of an agent who went undercover for years, slowly gaining the trust of the spies, collecting their secrets, and meticulously documenting their every move. He was a hero, that man, his grandfather said. Not because he carried a gun, but because he carried a heavy burden of deception for his country. He had to become a ghost to catch the ghosts. Leo dreamt of this undercover agent, a man who lived a double life, his heart a locked box of secrets. He imagined the constant fear of being discovered, the loneliness of not being able to be himself. It was a different kind of bravery, a quiet, internal strength that Leo found even more fascinating than the loud heroism of the G-men. After the war, the opponent changed, but the game remained the same. The new adversary was the Soviet Union, and the new battleground was the Cold War. The fear was no longer of open invasion, but of secret infiltration. The weapon was not the bomb, but ideology. It was the era of the Red Scare, his grandfather said, and Leo could hear the weariness in his voice. There was a genuine threat, Leo, don't get me wrong. There were Soviet agents who wanted to steal our atomic secrets, who wanted to turn our own people against us. But fear is a fire, and it can spread out of control. Sometimes, the smoke gets so thick that you can't tell the real enemy from your own shadow. Leo learned about the hunt for atomic spies, individuals who had passed on classified information about the Manhattan Project to the Soviets. His grandfather spoke of the intricate work of cryptanalysts, people who could stare at a jumble of meaningless letters and numbers and, through sheer force of intellect, pull out a coherent message. It was like being a codebreaker in a world of secrets. He described the Venona Project, a top-secret program to decrypt Soviet intelligence messages. For years, we were reading their mail, his grandfather said with a wry smile. They thought their codes were unbreakable, but we had a team of brilliant minds who, day after day, chipped away at the wall of secrecy. It was through Venona that we confirmed the identities of many of the atomic spies. It was a silent victory, one the public wouldn't know about for decades. Leo dreamt of the codebreakers, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their monitors. He saw the encrypted messages as tangled knots of yarn, and the cryptanalysts as patient weavers, slowly, carefully, entangling the threads until a clear pattern emerged. It was a battle of wits, a silent, intellectual war fought in windowless rooms. But his grandfather also spoke of the darker side of this era. He talked about the pressure to find communists everywhere, the loyalty oaths and the blacklists. He spoke of how the Bureau, under Hoover's iron grip, sometimes cast its net too wide, investigating people not for their actions, but for their beliefs. It was a time of suspicion, where a person's patriotism could be questioned for the books they read or the company they kept. "This was the fear I told you about, Leo," his grandfather said, his voice heavy. "The fear of losing our way. The Bureau's job is to investigate crime, to protect the nation from real threats. But it is not its job to police what people think. That is a dangerous line to cross, and in those years, we sometimes stumbled over it. It's the hardest lesson for any law enforcement agency to learn. How to protect a free society without undermining the very freedoms you are sworn to protect." Leo felt the weight of this dilemma. How do you fight an enemy who hides among your own people? How do you find the guilty without harming the innocent? It was a puzzle with no easy answer, a tightrope walk over a chasm of fear and suspicion. He learned about COINTELPRO, or the Counterintelligence Program, an initiative that began by targeting the Communist Party but later expanded to include other groups, including civil rights organizations, anti-war protesters, and student activists. His grandfather didn't shy away from the truth. He spoke of the Bureau's attempts to disrupt and discredit these groups, of the anonymous letters, the planted stories, and the surveillance. It was a chapter of the FBI's history that was not heroic, a time when the powerful tool of the Bureau was used not just to enforce the law, but to suppress dissent. It was a mistake, his grandfather said simply, his gaze distant. Born of fear, born of a belief that we knew what was best for the country, even if it meant bending the rules. But the rules are what keep us from becoming the monsters we hunt. The law is the line. And we crossed it. It took a long time and a lot of courage from people both inside and outside the Bureau, to admit that and to try and set things right. Leo's dreams that night were a swirl of conflicting images. He saw the brave undercover agent, the brilliant codebreaker, and the determined G-man. But he also saw the shadow of suspicion falling over innocent people, the fear in their eyes, the injustice of being watched and judged for their thoughts. He was learning that the story of the FBI was not a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a human story, a story of great triumphs and great failures, of noble intentions and flawed execution. It was the story of a nation struggling with its own identity, its own fears, and its own ideals. As he drifted into a deeper sleep, Leo understood that the real puzzle was not just about finding the bad guys. The real puzzle was about how to be good, how to be just, in a world that was messy and complicated. It was a puzzle that his grandfather, and the Bureau itself, had spent a lifetime trying to solve. And as the city lights painted soft patterns on his bedroom wall, Leo knew that this was the puzzle he wanted to spend his life thinking about, too. The story was not just about history, it was about the future. It was about the kind of agent, and the kind of person, he hoped to one day become. The fight for civil rights was dawning, and the Bureau would find itself at the very heart of the storm. The storm, when it came, did not arrive with the thunder of cannons or the whisper of spies' coded messages. It came with the sound of marching feet, of voices raised in song, and of a powerful, resonant dream of equality. The civil rights movement, his grandfather explained, was one of the most important and turbulent periods in American history, and the FBI was right in the middle of it, a silent, watchful giant in a landscape of profound social change. This was a different kind of battle, Leo, his grandfather said one evening, the city lights outside casting long, dancing shadows on the bedroom wall. The lines weren't drawn on a map of Europe or in the back alleys of Chicago. They were drawn on the streets of our own cities, in the hearts and minds of our own people. The fight was for the very soul of the country. Leo had learned about Martin Luther King Jr. in school, a hero who fought with words and with peace. But his grandfather's story added a layer of complexity that his history books had missed. He explained that J. Edgar Hoover, the man who had built the FBI into a formidable institution, was deeply suspicious of Dr. King. He saw the movement's calls for civil disobedience as a threat to social order and, fueled by the lingering paranoia of the Cold War, He feared that communists were secretly influencing the movement's leaders. Hoover was a man of order, his grandfather sighed. He believed in a rigid structure, in rules that were black and white. The civil rights movement was challenging that order, demanding that the country look at the ugly gray areas of its own injustice. Hoover couldn't or wouldn't see the moral righteousness of the cause. He only saw the disruption. And so, the bureau that had hunted spies and gangsters began to watch the watchers. His grandfather described the extensive surveillance of Dr. King and other civil rights leaders. Agents followed them, tapped their phones, and placed listening devices in their hotel rooms. The goal of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, was shifted from foreign enemies to domestic citizens who were fighting for the rights promised to them in the Constitution. It was a profound contradiction, Leo, his grandfather said, his voice filled with a deep, lingering sorrow. We were using the tools of national security to monitor people who were asking the nation to live up to its own ideals. We were sworn to uphold the Constitution, yet we were targeting those who were demanding its protections. It was the Bureau's most troubled time, a period where we lost our moral compass. Leo tried to imagine it. He saw the brave marchers, their faces filled with hope and determination, and he saw the unseen eyes of the Bureau watching them, the unheard ears listening to their private conversations. It felt wrong, like a referee in a game who was secretly playing for the other team. He dreamt of agents sitting in darkened rooms, listening to recordings of Dr. King's powerful speeches, not with admiration, but with suspicion, searching for hidden meanings and secret connections that weren't there. But his grandfather's story was never just one of darkness. He always found the glimmers of light, the moments of redemption. He told Leo about the other side of the Bureau's work during that era, the part of the story that was often forgotten. While Hoover was focused on the perceived threat of subversion, there were agents on the ground who were facing a very real and violent threat, he said. In the South, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups were using terror to fight against integration. They were bombing churches, burning crosses, and murdering people who were simply trying to register to vote. And it was the FBI's job to stop them. He told Leo about the Mississippi burning case in 1964, when 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared. Local law enforcement was uncooperative, even hostile. It was the FBI that was sent in to investigate. It was like a war zone, Leo, his grandfather recalled. The local people wouldn't talk. They were either part of the conspiracy or terrified of the consequences if they spoke out. Our agents were seen as invaders. His grandfather described the painstaking work of the investigation. Hundreds of agents flooded the state. They didn't just look for clues, they had to break through a wall of silence and hatred. They had to go undercover, infiltrate the Klan, and slowly, piece by piece, uncover the truth. They found the bodies of the 3 young men buried in an earthen dam. And through the testimony of informants and the relentless pressure of the investigation, they were able to bring some of the perpetrators to justice. Those agents were heroes, his grandfather said, his voice firm. They were facing down pure, unadulterated evil. They were fighting for justice in a place where justice had been abandoned. They were doing the hard, dangerous work that the Bureau was created to do. They were the light in the darkness of that time. Leo's dreams that night were a tumultuous sea of images. He saw Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, his voice ringing out with a dream of a better world. He saw the shadowy figures of agents listening in, their faces hidden. But then he saw other agents, their faces grim with determination, wading through swamps in Mississippi, digging in the red earth, their eyes burning with a fierce commitment to finding the truth. He saw the 2 sides of the FBI at war with each other, the paranoid, fearful institution obsessed with control, and the dedicated, courageous investigators committed to justice. The civil rights era was a turning point, his grandfather concluded, as Leo's eyelids began to feel heavy. It forced the Bureau and the country to confront its own demons. The abuses of COINTELPRO were eventually exposed, leading to congressional investigations and new rules designed to prevent such things from ever happening again. The FBI had to learn, the hard way, that its power came with a profound responsibility, and that its true purpose was to protect all citizens, not just the ones it agreed with. He learned that after Hoover's death in 1972, the Bureau began a long and difficult process of reform. The 10-year limit was placed on the director's term, a direct response to Hoover's nearly 48-year reign. The agency began to actively recruit women and minorities, seeking to create a workforce that reflected the diversity of the nation it served. It was a slow, painful process of rebuilding trust, both with the public and within its own ranks. As Leo drifted off to sleep, he thought about the puzzle. The puzzle of how an organization could be both a hero and a villain in the same story. He realized that the FBI was not a monolith, it was made of people. People with courage and people with flaws. People who could rise to the occasion and people who could succumb to their own fears and prejudices. And the story of the Bureau was the story of that constant struggle, the push and pull between its better angels and its inner demons. It was a story that was still unfolding, a puzzle that was still being solved. And as the city hummed its nightly lullaby, Leo knew that the next chapter would bring new challenges, new enemies, and new tests of the Bureau's character. The era of organized crime was waiting. The whispers of the mafia were growing louder. The whispers his grandfather spoke of were not the hushed secrets of spies, but the guttural, coded language of a different kind of secret society, one that had grown in the shadows of America's great cities for decades. This was the Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, a criminal empire built on fear, corruption, and a twisted code of honor. For years, his grandfather explained, their existence had been a subject of debate, even denial. For the longest time, Mr. Hoover didn't want to admit they were real, his grandfather said, a note of old frustration in his voice. He believed that acknowledging a nationwide criminal syndicate was like admitting failure. He preferred to focus on bank robbers and communists, enemies that were easier to define, easier to rally the public against. But the Mafia wasn't a gang of thugs, it was a corporation of crime. It was quiet, it was patient, and it was everywhere. Leo learned that for decades, the Mafia had operated with near impunity. They controlled unions, corrupted politicians, and ran illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion rackets that generated millions. They were a cancer growing on the heart of the country, but they were masters of silence. Their code, omerta, meant that no one talked. To speak to the authorities was a death sentence. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? His grandfather asked, posing the familiar puzzle in a new context. How do you prosecute criminals when witnesses are too terrified to testify, when your own evidence is tainted by corruption? For a long time, we were fighting them with one hand tied behind our backs. We could arrest a soldier here, a captain there, but we could never touch the bosses. We were trimming the branches of a poison tree, but the roots were deep and strong. The turning point, he explained, came in 1957, at a quiet meeting in the small town of Appalachian, New York. Dozens of the country's most powerful mob bosses had gathered for a summit. A curious state trooper noticed the parade of expensive cars arriving at a secluded estate and decided to investigate. The sudden police presence caused panic. Dons and capos, dressed in their fine suits, were caught fleeing through the woods, trying to escape the unexpected raid. Appalachian was a wake-up call, his grandfather said. It was a clumsy, almost comical event, but it blew the lid off the whole thing. The public could no longer deny the existence of the Mafia. And more importantly, the Bureau could no longer ignore it. The war was declared. But declaring war and winning it were two different things. The old methods weren't working. The Bureau needed a new weapon, a new way to attack the very structure of the criminal enterprise. That weapon, Leo learned, was a law with a deceptively simple name: the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. RICO was a stroke of genius, his grandfather said with a spark of admiration. It was passed in 1970, and it changed the game completely. Before RICO, we had to prove a specific crime, an extortion, a murder. But the bosses were smart, they never got their own hands dirty. They gave the orders, but the soldiers carried them out. RICO allowed us to go after the entire criminal organization. We didn't have to just prove a single crime. We had to prove a pattern of criminal activity. We could prosecute the bosses for running the criminal enterprise itself. Leo imagined it as a spider's web. Before, they could only snip at the outer threads. But with RICO, they could go right for the spider at the center of the web, the one who had spun the whole thing. It was a legal tool as powerful as the fingerprint library or the science lab had been in their day. But even with RICO, they needed a way in. They needed to break the code of silence. This led to the most dangerous work of all, going undercover. His grandfather told him about the agents who had to transform themselves, to leave their own lives behind and step into the world of the mob. It was the ultimate test of an agent's courage and integrity, he said, his voice low and serious. These men, and later, women, had to live a lie 24 hours a day. They had to talk like mobsters, think like mobsters, and earn the trust of men who would kill them without a second thought if they suspected the truth. They were walking a tightrope without a net, and the fall was a long way down. He told Leo the story of Joe Pistone, an agent who went undercover as a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. For 6 years, Pistone lived inside the Bonanno crime family. He was so convincing, so trusted, that he was on the verge of being officially becoming a full member of the mafia. His work led to over 100 convictions and crippled the family he had infiltrated. Think of the pressure, Leo, his grandfather whispered. Every word you say, every move you make, is being judged. You have to remember your fake history, your fake family. You have to laugh at their jokes, you have to witness their crimes, and you can never, ever show your disgust or your fear. And the whole time, you have to remember who you are, the real you, the agent who is there to uphold the law. Some men got lost. The line between the role and the self became blurry. Leo dreamt of Donnie Brasco. He saw him sitting in a smoky social club, surrounded by men with hard eyes and easy smiles. He felt the constant, gnawing tension, the fear of a slip of the tongue, the moral weight of participating in a world of darkness in order to bring it into the light. It was a lonely, terrifying existence, and Leo felt a profound respect for the agents who had walked that path. Through the power of RICO and the bravery of undercover agents, the FBI began to dismantle the mafia, family by family. The great bosses, the so-called dons, who had seemed untouchable, were paraded before the cameras in handcuffs. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. We broke them, his grandfather said, not with triumph, but with a quiet satisfaction. We showed that no one, no matter how powerful or how feared, was above the law. It was a long, brutal fight, and it cost a lot. But we took back our cities from their grip. We restored a measure of faith in the system. As Leo grew sleepy, the images of the mafia war swirled in his head. He saw the spider's web, and the patient, determined agents who were snipping its central strands. He saw the brave undercover agents, living in the shadows to serve the light. He was learning that the FBI was not just an organization, it was an idea that was constantly being tested and redefined. It had to adapt, to learn, to create new tools and new tactics for new enemies. His grandfather tucked him in, his hand resting gently on Leo's forehead. The world keeps changing, Leo. The enemies keep changing. After the mob, a new kind of threat began to emerge, one that didn't want to just steal money, but to steal lives, to spread fear on a global scale. The age of terrorism was beginning, and the Bureau would have to transform itself once again. The puzzle was about to get bigger, and the stakes higher than ever before. Leo closed his eyes, the hum of the city a comforting drone, and he drifted to sleep, ready for the next chapter in the unending story of the watchmen and women who stood on the front lines of a war that never ends. The new enemy, as Leo's grandfather described it, was different from any they had faced before. The gangsters wanted money. The spies wanted secrets. But this new adversary, the terrorist, wanted something far more terrifying. They wanted to sow fear. Their goal was not to enrich themselves, but to shatter the sense of safety that people took for granted, to turn the ordinary places of life, office buildings, airplanes, city streets, into battlegrounds. It was a different kind of evil, Leo, his grandfather said, his voice taking on a grim, somber tone. It was an evil that celebrated destruction, that saw value in the death of innocent people. It wasn't about logic or profit. It was about hatred. And that is the hardest thing of all to fight, because it doesn't follow any rules. Leo learned that the FBI's first major encounters with modern international terrorism were not on foreign battlefields, but right in the heart of their own country. His grandfather told him about the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. A massive truck bomb had been detonated in the parking garage beneath the North Tower, intended to topple the tower and cause thousands of casualties. It failed in its ultimate goal, but it succeeded in killing 6 people, injuring over 1,000, and leaving a gaping, smoking wound in the city's skyline and its psyche. It was a shock to the system, his grandfather recalled. We had dealt with domestic terrorism before, but this was different. This was a group of international extremists, bringing a foreign war to our doorstep. We had to learn a whole new set of skills. We weren't just investigators anymore. We had to become intelligence analysts, linguists, and international diplomats, all at once. He described the massive investigation that followed. It was a classic FBI puzzle, but on a global scale. The key piece of evidence was a vehicle identification number found on a piece of the exploded truck. It was a tiny fragment of metal, but it was enough. Like pulling on a single thread, the agents followed the trail from that number to the rental agency, to the man who had rented the truck, and finally, to the cell of conspirators who had planned and carried out the attack. It was brilliant detective work, his grandfather said with a flash of pride. A testament to the Bureau's core strength, painstaking, methodical investigation. But it also showed us our weakness. We had caught them after they had struck. We had solved the crime, but we hadn't prevented it. And we knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would try again. Leo dreamt of the twisted, blackened steel in the basement of the Great Tower. He saw the agents in their blue jackets, sifting through the debris, their faces smudged with soot, searching for the tiny clues that would tell the story of the crime. He felt the urgency, the sense that this was not just about bringing criminals to justice, but about preventing a future catastrophe. But the threat was not just from overseas. His grandfather then told him about a different kind of terror, one that grew from the soil of their own country. He spoke of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. If the World Trade Center bombing was a shock, Oklahoma City was a heartbreak, he said, his voice cracking slightly. This wasn't a foreign enemy. This was one of our own. A man filled with hatred for his own government, who parked a truck full of explosives outside a federal building, a building that housed offices and, on its second floor, a daycare center. The Alfred P. Mora Federal Building was destroyed. 168 people were killed, including 19 children. It was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. The anger and the grief were immense, his grandfather said. The whole country was crying. And in the middle of all that pain, we had to work. We had to find who did this. The pressure was unbelievable. The country wasn't just looking for justice, it was looking for reassurance. It was looking to us to make sense of the senseless. The investigation was another monumental effort. Again, it came down to a single piece of the puzzle. The axle of the rental truck that had carried the bomb, which had been thrown clear of the blast. An agent found it, and on it, a vehicle identification number. The trail led them to a rental agency in Kansas, and to a description of the man who had rented the truck, Timothy McVeigh. "We put all our resources into it," his grandfather said. "We had agents all over the country, following thousands of leads. We used every tool we had, from old-fashioned interviews to the most advanced forensic science. And we found him. We found him and his co-conspirators. We brought them to justice. But it was a victory that felt like a defeat. We had won the battle, but we had lost so much." Leo's dreams that night were filled with sorrow. He saw the broken face of the Mora building, the empty swings in the playground. He saw the faces of the firefighters and the agents, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and grief. He understood that this was a different kind of work. It wasn't a thrilling chase or a clever puzzle. It was a heavy, heartbreaking burden. It was about walking into the center of a tragedy and, with steady hands and a clear mind, trying to piece together the truth, so that the healing could begin. These two bombings, New York and Oklahoma City, were the prelude, his grandfather said, his voice a low whisper in the darkroom. They were the warning signs. They taught us that the world had changed. The old walls between foreign and domestic threats, between law enforcement and intelligence, were crumbling. We were fighting a new kind of war, a war in the shadows, against an enemy who had no uniform and no borders. He explained how the Bureau began to change. It started building up its counter-terrorism capabilities, creating joint task forces that brought together federal agents, state troopers, and local police. It placed agents in embassies around the world, trying to build the relationships and gather the intelligence needed to stop attacks before they happened. It was a race against time, a desperate effort to adapt to a threat that was constantly evolving. We were getting better, his grandfather said. We were connecting the dots, we were stopping plots that the public never even heard about. But we were still thinking like cops. We were trained to build a case, to make an arrest, to present evidence in court. The new enemy required a new way of thinking. We had to learn to think like spies, to anticipate, to disrupt, to prevent. We were learning, but we weren't learning fast enough. Leo felt a sense of dread creep into his heart. He knew what was coming. He had seen the images on television, had heard the stories his whole life. His grandfather's history lesson was approaching a day that had changed the world forever, a day of blue skies and black smoke. As he lay in his bed, the familiar city sounds outside his window seemed different, more fragile. He thought about the puzzle, the great, sprawling puzzle of the FBI's history. The pieces were getting bigger, the picture more terrifying. The stakes were no longer just about justice, they were about survival. And as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he saw the two towers of the World Trade Center standing tall against the morning sky, unaware of the shadow that was racing towards them. The final, terrible lesson was about to begin. The day that Leo's grandfather spoke of next arrived, as most terrible days do, with a beautiful, cloudless sky. It was a Tuesday in September. Leo had seen the images, of course. They were burned into the memory of his generation, a scar on the face of history. But to hear his grandfather tell it was to understand it not as a spectacle of destruction, but as a profound, personal failure and a crucible from which a new FBI would be born. We knew they were coming, his grandfather said, and the simple words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. That's the hardest part to live with, Leo. We knew. We just didn't know what. We had pieces of the puzzle, hundreds of them, scattered all over the world. But we couldn't see the picture. Not until it was too late. He described the months leading up to September 11, 2001, as a time of frantic, unseen activity. The intelligence community was buzzing with warnings of a major attack planned by Al-Qaeda. The system, as his grandfather put it, was blinking red. There were reports of suspicious individuals taking flying lessons, of money being wired from overseas, of chatter picked up by signals intelligence. But the pieces were in different boxes. The CIA had some, the NSA had others, and the FBI had its own. And the walls between those boxes were high and thick. We had an agent in Phoenix who wrote a memo, his grandfather said, his voice barely a whisper. He warned that extremists were taking flight training. He recommended a nationwide canvass of flight schools. But his warning got lost in the bureaucracy. We had another agent in Minneapolis who arrested a man, Zacharias Moussaoui, who had paid thousands in cash for flight simulator training on a Boeing 747. The agent was convinced he was a terrorist planning to fly a plane into a building. He fought for weeks to get a warrant to search his laptop. He begged his superiors, but he was denied. The wall was too high. Leo imagined the frustration, the desperation of those agents. It was like they were shouting a warning, but their voices were muffled by layers of rules and regulations. They held a critical piece of the puzzle, but they weren't allowed to show it to anyone else who might have the connecting piece. Then came the morning. His grandfather didn't describe the planes hitting the towers. He didn't need to. Instead, he described the moment the news broke inside the FBI headquarters. The confusion, then the dawning, sickening horror. The realization that this was it. This was the attack they had been warned about. This was the failure they had been trying to prevent. In that moment, everything changed, he said. The world we knew, the bureau we knew, it all ended on that morning. In the chaos and the dust of that day, we were reborn. We had no choice. In the immediate aftermath, the FBI launched the largest and most complex investigation in its history, codenamed Pentbomb. Every agent in the country was working the case. They had to identify the hijackers, trace their movements, and, most importantly, find out if more attacks were coming. It was a race against the clock, with the fate of the country at stake, his grandfather said. We were working 24 hours a day, sleeping under our desks. We followed every lead, no matter how small. We found the rental cars they had left at the airports. We found their credit card receipts, their apartment leases. We pieced together their final days and weeks, trying to build a picture of the conspiracy. Leo dreamt of a giant, chaotic room, the walls covered with maps and charts and photographs. He saw agents on the phone, shouting to be heard over the din, their faces etched with exhaustion and a fierce, burning intensity. They were not just solving a crime. They were trying to hold a wounded nation together, to provide answers where there were only questions, to offer justice in the face of unimaginable loss. But the real change, the deep, fundamental change, came after the dust had settled. The 9/11 Commission, which was formed to investigate the attacks, delivered a damning verdict. It described a failure of imagination. It detailed the missed opportunities, the lack of information sharing, the walls between the agencies. The conclusion was clear. The FBI had to stop being just a law enforcement agency and become a true intelligence agency. It had to prevent attacks, not just investigate them after the fact. It was the biggest transformation in the Bureau's history since Hoover created it, his grandfather explained. We had to tear down the old structure and build a new one. We had to change our very DNA. We created the National Security Branch, bringing our counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and intelligence divisions under one roof. We started hiring thousands of new analysts, linguists, and computer scientists. We had to learn to think not like cops, but like spies. He described the new philosophy: collect, analyze, disseminate. The goal was no longer just to build a case for court. The goal was to gather intelligence, to understand the enemy's plans, and to share that information with everyone who needed it: the CIA, the NSA, state and local police. The walls had to come down. It was hard, Leo, he admitted. Agents who had spent their careers building cases for prosecution had to learn a new way of working. They had to learn to share their sources, to put the needs of national security above the desire for a conviction. It was a culture clash. But we had no choice. The memory of that blue September sky was a powerful motivator. Leo understood. It was as if the Bureau had been a collection of skilled musicians, each playing their own instrument perfectly, but with no conductor and no sheet music. After 9/11, they had to learn to play as an orchestra, to follow a single score, to create a symphony of intelligence that could drown out the noise of the enemy. As he grew sleepy, the image of the falling towers in his mind was replaced by a new one. The image of a building being constructed. He saw the new FBI rising from the ashes of the old, a different, more complex structure. It was an agency that had been humbled, that had been forced to confront its greatest failure. But it was also an agency that was determined to learn, to adapt, to become the shield the country needed it to be. The war on terror is a war in the shadows, and it never ends, his grandfather said, his voice a soft murmur. But the Bureau is different now. It's smarter, it's faster, it's more connected. It's not perfect, Leo. It never will be. It's still made of people, with all their flaws and their fears. But it is always striving, always learning. And that is the most important thing. Leo closed his eyes, the weight of the story settling upon him. He knew that the history of the FBI was not just a collection of stories about the past. It was a lesson for the future. It was about the need to be vigilant, the courage to admit failure, and the wisdom to change. And as the city outside hummed its endless, watchful tune, Leo knew that the next chapter of the story was already being written, not on the streets of New York or in the fields of Pennsylvania, but in a place he couldn't see, a place made of light and electricity, the new, invisible frontier of cyberspace. The new frontier, as Leo's grandfather described it, was a world without borders, without physical laws, a place where a new kind of crime was flourishing. It was cyberspace, the vast, interconnected network of computers that had quietly wrapped itself around the globe. And in this new world, the old rules of investigation no longer applied. Imagine, Leo, his grandfather said, his voice filled with a sense of wonder and apprehension. A place where a thief can steal from a bank in New York while sitting in a cafe in Eastern Europe. A place where a spy can walk through the front door of a company's most secret files without ever leaving his own home. A place where a terrorist can recruit followers and plan an attack using nothing more than a keyboard. This was the new challenge. The enemy was a ghost in the machine. Leo learned that the FBI's first forays into cybercrime were like a local police officer trying to direct traffic on a global superhighway. The criminals were always one step ahead. They could hide their tracks, bounce their signals around the world in the blink of an eye, and use encryption to make their communications unreadable. The evidence was not a fingerprint on a windowsill, but a fleeting string of ones and zeros. We had to learn a whole new language, his grandfather explained. We had to become digital detectives. We had to recruit a new kind of agent, not just cops and lawyers, but hackers and coders, people who understood the architecture of this new world. We had to build our own labs, not with microscopes and test tubes, but with servers and forensic software. He told Leo about the early cyber criminals, the hackers who were often motivated by curiosity or a desire to show off their skills. But soon, that changed. Organized crime syndicates, the modern-day descendants of the mafia, realized that there was more money to be made online than on the streets. They began to engage in massive fraud, identity theft, and ransomware attacks, where they would lock up a company's or a hospital's entire computer system and demand a ransom to release it. It was extortion on a massive scale, his grandfather said. And it was incredibly difficult to fight. The criminals were in other countries, protected by governments that were either unwilling or unable to stop them. We had to become international diplomats, forging alliances with law enforcement agencies around the world, trying to build a global coalition against a global threat. Leo dreamt of a digital chase. He saw an agent, not in a car, but sitting at a computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He saw the agent's digital avatar pursuing a shadowy figure through a maze of glowing data streams, a high-speed pursuit through the circuits of the internet. It was a thrilling, almost beautiful image, but Leo understood the real-world consequences. He saw the faces of the people whose life savings had been stolen, the chaos in the hospital whose systems were frozen. But the threat was not just criminal. The same tools were being used by foreign intelligence agencies. The spies of the Cold War had traded their trench coats for keyboards. They were no longer just trying to steal military secrets. They were targeting corporations, stealing intellectual property, the very blueprints of innovation that drove the economy. It was the greatest transfer of wealth in history, his grandfather said, his voice grim. Nations were stealing the research and development of our companies, saving themselves billions and putting our own industries at a disadvantage. It was a silent, undeclared economic war, and it was being fought on the battlefield of cyberspace. And then there was terrorism. Terrorist groups were using the internet to spread their propaganda, to recruit new members, and to communicate securely. The web gave them a global platform to inspire and direct attacks, creating a new and dangerous phenomenon. The lone wolf, an individual with no formal ties to a terrorist group, who becomes radicalized online and decides to carry out an attack on their own. This is our biggest nightmare, Leo, his grandfather said, his voice low and urgent. The lone wolf is the hardest to find. They don't attend a training camp. They don't communicate with a known terrorist. They just sit in their room, in front of their computer, and fall down a rabbit hole of hatred. How do you stop a crime that is being planned inside a person's own mind? This led to the most difficult and controversial question of the modern era for the FBI: the balance between privacy and security. To find the terrorists, to stop the spies, to catch the cyber criminals, the Bureau needed to be able to access digital communications. But the same technology that allowed people to connect with their loved ones, to run their businesses, and to express their opinions, was also being used by the bad guys. And that technology was increasingly being protected by powerful encryption. It's the challenge of our time, his grandfather said with a sigh. We believe in the right to privacy. We believe in the freedom of speech. But we also have a duty to protect the country from harm. And we are now facing a situation where the criminals and terrorists can communicate in ways that are completely dark to us. We call it going dark. It's as if the whole world has adopted a code of silence, a digital omerta. He explained the debate over encryption. The tech companies, wanting to protect their users' privacy, were building devices and apps with end-to-end encryption that even they could not unlock. The FBI argued that they needed a backdoor, a way to access the data of suspected criminals and terrorists, with a warrant from a judge. But the privacy advocates and tech companies argued that any backdoor created for the good guys could, and would, be exploited by the bad guys. There is no easy answer, Leo, his grandfather said. It's a puzzle that we, as a society, have to solve together. How much privacy are we willing to give up for how much security? It's a tightrope walk, just like the one we faced during the civil rights era. We have to find a way to protect the nation without breaking the fundamental principles on which it was built. As Leo's eyes grew heavy, the digital world swirled in his imagination. He saw the glowing web of connections that encircled the planet, a thing of both incredible beauty and immense danger. He saw the agents of the FBI, the new digital watchmen, standing guard on this invisible frontier. They were no longer just chasing shadows, they were chasing ghosts in a machine that was constantly changing, constantly evolving. His grandfather's final words for the night were a summary of the Bureau's entire history. A lesson that had been learned and relearned through a century of trial and error. The tools change, Leo. The enemies change. The world changes. But the mission remains the same. Fidelity, bravery, integrity. To protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States. That is the core of the Bureau. That is the puzzle that we must solve, every single day. Leo drifted to sleep, the hum of the city's electricity a lullaby. He knew the story was not over. The history of the FBI was a living thing, a story that was being written in the quiet hum of servers, in the frantic clicking of keyboards, and in the difficult, necessary debates that shaped a free and secure society. The puzzle was never finished. And as he slept, Leo dreamt of a future where he, too, might be one of the watchmen, one of the puzzle solvers, standing on the ever-shifting frontier of justice. The room was quiet now, save for the gentle breathing of the sleeping boy and the distant, ever-present hum of the city. Leo's grandfather looked at his grandson, a faint smile on his lips. The long journey through the Bureau's history was over for the night. He had led Leo from the age of steam trains and telegraphs to the age of encrypted data and global networks. He had shown him the heroes and the flawed men, the triumphs and the tragedies, the simple certainties of the past and the complex, agonizing questions of the present. He had watched Leo's eyes light up with excitement at the stories of the G-men and their relentless pursuit of gangsters. He had seen the quiet respect in his gaze for the undercover agents who walked into the darkness of the mob and the spy rings. He had felt the boy's own heart break a little when he spoke of the children of Oklahoma City, and he had seen the confusion and sorrow in his face as he tried to understand the injustices of the civil rights era. He had shared with Leo not just the history of an institution, but the moral education of a nation, with all its stumbles and its slow, painful progress towards a more perfect union. Leo was asleep, but his grandfather knew the stories would live on in his dreams. Tonight, perhaps, he would dream of the first agents, men armed with little more than their integrity and a belief in the rule of law, trying to connect the patchwork of a nation. He might dream of the brilliant codebreakers of Venona, patiently entangling the secrets of an empire. He might see the determined faces of the agents in Mississippi, digging for truth in the blood-soaked soil of hatred. He might fly through the glowing canyons of cyberspace, a digital watchman on a new and boundless frontier. These stories, his grandfather hoped, would teach Leo something important. They would teach him that justice is not a destination, but a journey, a constant struggle. They would teach him that power is a tool that must be wielded with wisdom and humility, and that the laws designed to protect us must never be used to oppress us. They would teach him that the greatest threats often come not from outside, but from within, from our own fear, our own prejudice, our own certainty that we are right. He looked out the window at the city, a sprawling galaxy of lights. Down there, in that sleeping metropolis, the story of the FBI was still being written, every second of every day. In a quiet office, an analyst was sifting through intelligence, looking for the faint signal in the noise that might prevent the next attack. In a dark alley, an agent was meeting an informant, risking their life to stop a shipment of drugs or guns. In a sterile lab, a scientist was matching a strand of DNA, bringing a killer to justice and closure to a grieving family. In a courtroom, a special agent was testifying, his or her word a pillar in the architecture of a conviction. And in a secure data center, a cyber agent was fighting a silent war against an invisible enemy halfway around the world. It was a story without end, a puzzle with a million pieces, constantly shifting and rearranging themselves into new and unexpected patterns. The Bureau was not a building or a badge or a gun. It was the people. It was the chain of hands that had passed the torch of responsibility from one generation to the next, from Charles Bonaparte's first investigators to the diverse, highly trained agents of the 21st century. It was a living institution, forever marked by its past, forever challenged by its future. His grandfather gently pulled the blanket over Leo's shoulder. The boy stirred, a soft murmur escaping his lips. Perhaps he was already solving a puzzle in his sleep, piecing together the clues of a dream. His grandfather smiled. The world would need good puzzle solvers. It would need men and women of integrity, of bravery, of fidelity to the ideals of justice and the sanctity of the law. "Sleep well, my little agent," he whispered, his voice full of love and hope. "The watch never ends, but for tonight, you can rest." He turned off the small lamp, plunging the room into a soft darkness, pierced only by the city lights that stood like distant, silent sentinels. The history was vast, the challenges immense, but for now, there was peace. The story was told, the boy was asleep, and outside, the quiet, unending work of the watchmen and women continued. A silent promise in the heart of the night that when the sun rose again, they would still be there, standing guard on the frontiers of a world that never stopped changing, forever dedicated to the puzzle that never ends. And in the heart of the sleeping boy, a dream of service, of justice, of a future yet to be written, had firmly taken root. In the heart of a city that never slept, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and yellow cabs buzzed like busy bees, lived a little boy named Leo. Leo wasn't like other boys his age. While they dreamt of superheroes in capes and villains with laser eyes, Leo dreamt of something far more real, something whispered in the hushed corridors of power and etched in the annals of his nation's history. He dreamt of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His grandfather, a man with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 solved cases, had been an agent. He didn't talk much about his work, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would tell Leo stories. Not of car chases and shootouts, but of quiet observation, of piecing together puzzles that no one else could solve. He spoke of a time when the Bureau was just a fledgling idea, a handful of determined men against a rising tide of crime that threatened to engulf the nation. It was a different time, Leo, his grandfather would say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. The country was growing, changing. With that change came new kinds of shadows, new kinds of monsters that didn't fit into the neat little boxes people had built. Leo would listen, his chin resting on his small hands, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and a deep, burgeoning curiosity. He learned about the early days before the iconic name, FBI, even existed. His grandfather spoke of the Bureau of Investigation, a small force of special agents created in 1908 by Attorney General Charles Bonaparte. It wasn't a glamorous beginning. They were detectives without a home, a force born out of necessity to investigate crimes that crossed state lines, a problem that was becoming more and more common in a rapidly industrializing America. Imagine, Leo, his grandfather whispered one night, the only light in the room coming from the sliver of moon peeking through the curtains. A country connected by railroads, by telegraph wires, but the law stopped at the state border. A criminal could commit a terrible crime in one state and simply hop on a train to another, and he was practically a free man. It was a puzzle, a giant, frustrating puzzle. Leo imagined it. He saw a map of the United States, a patchwork of different colors, and a shadowy figure skipping from one color to another, laughing as the lines on the map protected him. Then, he saw a small group of men, their faces determined, their minds sharp, drawing new lines, not of division, but of connection, lines of justice that stretched from coast to coast. These were the stories that filled Leo's dreams. He dreamt of Agent Charles Bonaparte, not as a distant historical figure, but as a man with a vision, a man who saw the broken pieces of the puzzle and knew they had to be put together. He dreamt of the first agents, men who were accountants and lawyers and detectives, pioneers in a new frontier of law enforcement. They didn't have the fancy gadgets Leo saw in movies. Their greatest weapons were their minds, their integrity, and their unwavering belief that no one was above the law. One evening, Leo asked the question that had been bubbling in his mind for weeks. "Grandpa," he said, his voice small but clear, "were you ever scared?" His grandfather smiled, a sad, gentle smile. "Every day, Leo. But not of the things you might think. I wasn't afraid of the criminals, Leo. I was afraid of failing. Afraid of missing a clue, of letting someone down. But most of all, I was afraid of forgetting why we were there in the first place." The Bureau is a powerful tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill. The real fear was that we might lose our way, that the shadows we were chasing might start to seep into our own hearts. Leo pondered this. It was a grown-up kind of fear, one he didn't fully understand, but he felt the weight of it in his grandfather's words. It made the stories feel even more real, more important. The weeks turned into months, and Leo's nightly lessons in history continued. His grandfather spoke of the years after the Bureau's birth, a time of struggle and uncertainty. The agency was still finding its footing, its purpose sometimes questioned, its authority challenged. Then came a man who would change everything, a name that would become synonymous with the FBI for the next half-century, J. Edgar Hoover. Mr. Hoover was a force of nature, his grandfather said, a flicker of something complex in his eyes. Respect, yes, but something else, too. He took the Bureau, this small, somewhat disorganized group of investigators, and he forged it into a weapon. He was a librarian, you know. He believed in order, in information. He believed that knowledge was power, and he set about collecting it. Leo learned about the creation of the Fingerprint Identification Division. His grandfather described it as a magical library, not of books, but of people. Millions of cards, each one holding the unique, swirling pattern of a person's touch. Before that, a criminal could change his name, grow a beard, move to a new city, and become a whole new person, his grandfather explained. But he couldn't change his fingerprints. It was the first time we had a way to truly know who someone was, a signature that could never be forged. Leo dreamt of a vast, quiet room, filled with endless rows of cabinets. He saw himself as a tiny agent, pulling out a card and looking at the intricate loops and whorls of a fingerprint under a magnifying glass. He saw the lines transform, telling a story, revealing a secret. It wasn't about chasing someone down, it was about knowing them, understanding them from a single, silent trace they left behind. Then came the stories of the scientific crime lab, a place that sounded to Leo like a wizard's workshop. His grandfather spoke of ballistics, of matching a bullet to the gun that fired it. He described how a single strand of hair or a fiber from a coat could unravel a whole conspiracy. The bad guys had guns and they had speed, his grandfather said. But we had science. We had patience. We learned to listen to the whispers of the evidence, the stories that objects told when no person would speak. These were the years of the G-men, the era of gangsters and public enemies. His grandfather told him of John Dillinger, of Babyface, Nelson, of Pretty Boy, Floyd. But he didn't tell the stories the way the movies did. He spoke of the long, painstaking work, the stakeouts in the cold, the thousands of leads that went nowhere. He described the fear that these men spread, but also the determination of the agents who hunted them. It wasn't a glamorous chase, it was a relentless, methodical pursuit of justice, piece by piece, clue by clue. Hoover made the Bureau famous, his grandfather admitted. He made us heroes in the eyes of the public. It was important, in a way. People needed to believe that someone was fighting for them, that order could be brought out of chaos. But fame is a dangerous thing, Leo. It can make you forget that you serve the law, not the spotlight. Leo felt a shiver go down his spine. He was beginning to understand the other part of his grandfather's expression when he spoke of Hoover. The respect was for the builder, the man who created the modern FBI. The other part, the caution, was for the man who held so much power for so long. He was learning that even in stories about heroes, there were shades of gray, and that the biggest battles were not always fought with guns, but with ideas, with principles, with the quiet, constant struggle to stay true to a purpose. His grandfather pulled the blanket up to Leo's chin. The Bureau grew up, Leo. It went from a curious child to a powerful adult. And like any adult, it had to face new, more complicated problems. The world was getting bigger, and the shadows were getting longer. The gangsters were one thing, but soon we would be looking for a different kind of enemy, one you couldn't see, who didn't rob banks, but stole secrets. We were about to go to war, and the front lines were everywhere. The front lines of that war would be invisible. Leo's eyes grew heavy. He imagined the fingerprint library, the science labs, the determined faces of the G-men. But now, a new image entered his dreams. It was a world of whispers and secrets, of spies and coded messages. The puzzle was getting bigger, the pieces more complex. And as he drifted off to sleep, He knew that the story of the FBI was far from over. It was a story that was still being written, in the quiet offices and hidden corners of the world. A story of the unending watch against the shadows. The next chapter, he knew, would be about the spies. The world that Leo's grandfather described next was one of shifting alliances and silent, undeclared wars. The Roaring Twenties and the gangster era had given way to the grim realities of World War II and the long, tense twilight of the Cold War that followed. The enemies of the state were no longer just bank robbers with Tommy guns. They were foreign agents, saboteurs, and ideologues who sought to undermine the country from within. The war changed everything, his grandfather said, his voice softer now, tinged with a different kind of memory. Suddenly, the whole world was a chessboard, and we were one of the main players. The Bureau had to learn a new game, one with more subtle rules and much higher stakes. We weren't just chasing criminals anymore, Leo. We were hunting for ghosts. Leo pictured it. A vast, shadowy chessboard stretching across oceans and continents. The pieces weren't black and white, but shades of gray, and they moved in silence, their motives hidden. His grandfather explained that during World War II, the FBI was tasked with protecting the home front. This meant not only hunting for German and Japanese spies but also preventing sabotage in factories and ports that were vital to the war effort.